So just a few minutes ago, I finished up a conversation with Bishop Will Willimon. We talked about his book, Leading with the Sermon, and how that relates to preaching in this COVID-19 era. And it's a conversation, coffee with clergy, that I'd like to share with you. I appreciate you joining me on this Zoom call. But first of all, how are you doing? How's everything going? How's your sheltering in place?
We're all well and doing well, considering the isolation is getting old, but luckily a lot of the teaching and stuff I was doing was already online, so that hadn't been too big a change. But missing contact with colleagues and all. I see you're there in your study.
Right. Yeah. My study is now my dining room is now my study.
Is that Wake Chapel there behind you, framed on the wall?
That is actually Perkins Chapel at SMU.
Perkins Chapel.
Yeah.
Okay.
And
yeah.
I painted that. I'll tell you, it's funny, when I did my MDiv at Asbury.
Yeah.
And in my last semester there, I painted Estes Chapel and gave that to the to the seminary, and got a pretty nice scholarship as a result of.
Oh, how nice!
And so when I was looking at DMin programs, while I was still doing my MDiv, I thought, I'm going to look at the one at SMU, and so I painted Perkins, thinking that I might go there and try to do the same deal, but ended up, as you know, going to Duke, and I haven't gotten around to finishing a painting of Duke Chapel, but will.
Oh, good. Well, I encourage you to do that.
Yeah. So anyway, maybe through staying at home more, I'll have a chance to work on that and get that done. But so anyway, yeah, that's a painting that I never got to use in place of tuition.
Great.
Well, okay, so let's get down to it, Bishop. You're one of those guys that I have loved to read for a long time, long before we ever met, long before I ever even went into pastoral ministry. I just consumed so much of what you had written, and so when I saw this leading with the sermon come out, I got it and started reading it and loved it. But then, as things have changed in terms of how we do church, how we do worship, I went back and started rereading it with an eye towards online worship and what we're dealing with. But really, before I want to get to that, which I do want to talk to you about, of course, I want to know what motivated you to write this book in the first place. What were you seeing or not seeing in preaching that as it relates to leadership?
Well, the book is dedicated to my students like you in the DMin program at Duke. I think teaching leadership and having gotten to experience leadership from kind of the vantage point of being a bishop, as well as trying to be a pastoral leader myself, I've just have become impressed that leadership is just crucial. One of the things we say in the class is you only need leaders if an organization needs to go somewhere. In the present moment of the pandemic, I think we're discovering both. We're calling people forth, like Dr. Fauci, to be a leader. He's a doctor. He didn't plan to be a leader, but we badly need a leader who's a doctor. We're also seeing, not to mention any names, but a lot of people who are in leadership positions but appear to be unable to lead in the present moment and win the trust of their followers. So I was interested in leadership. Of course, I'm a preacher and always been interested in preaching. I think you ask, what did I see happening? One is I continue to see that preaching is the most important thing pastors do. Preaching is deeply and part of the Christian faith. As Paul says, faith comes from here. So I felt like what was I not seeing? I think one thing I was not seeing is that pastors not really claiming and utilizing their pulpit ministry tied to their the task of pastoral leadership. And so I hope to kind of bring those two together in this book.
Well, yeah, and that's one of the things. That's one of the reasons I think the book is so important for all in leadership. You talk about courage to lead from the pulpit, and I do think it ties very closely to many of the other things that you've written. Particularly, I know you and I have talked before about the Willie Earl book, and there was definitely an element of courage in preaching in that book as well. Did that book in any way kind of lead you here, do you think?
You know, I hadn't thought about it, but I think it's interesting. A book that I use a lot in my book is by Gil Rendell.
Right.
And the title of his book is called Quietly Courageous, Pastoral Leadership in the Present Age. Leadership and courage do kind of go together. And again, it fascinates me how some of the essential qualities of leadership are congruent with preaching. It takes courage to get up in the pulpit and to say, "Thus saith the Lord," and to speak a word. And it may be a word that a lot of people have a stake in not hearing, and that they have spent all week avoiding. Well, preachers do that all the time, and I think, like Gil Rendell and many commentators on leadership have shown, that leaders have got to have the courage to step up and put on the table matters that an organization needs to tackle, but yet is fearful to tackle. And so leaders often find themselves in situations where they have got to foment tough conversations. They, as I have written, leaders put people in pain that they've avoided for a long time, using some of the very best resources of the organization to avoid the pain. And so, yeah, leadership and courage, preaching and courage, that's together.
Sure. Well, so I do want to shift to preaching in this coronavirus era. I don't know if you've been watching many online sermons and worship services as of late. If you have, or if you have not, what's your advice there? And maybe what have you seen done well?
Well, I've preached myself in 3 different churches over the past few weeks, virtually, online, and I have observed a lot. I think we're all kind of finding our way. It's kind of the nature of preaching to be responsive. I mean, to be give and take. Preachers are not just throwing their voices out into a void, but they're interacting with a gathered congregation normally. And the congregation is busy sending signals and to the preacher, often non-verbally. Well, not to have that is a huge challenge. I think it was LeBron James, they were talking about going ahead and playing basketball, but without spectators. And
right.
LeBron James said, no, it's basketball. We don't, you're not having a basketball game if there's nobody there to see it. And I thought, well, you could say the same thing about preaching. However, we are in different demanding times, and I have been interested to see people try to work with that. I know I tuned into one place, a large church, cathedral-like church, and it ended up with 3 or 4 staff members sitting there 6 feet apart from each other in this cold, dark space, and it was really depressing. I mean, there was a kind of morbidity about it. Quite different, I found, was tuning into the National Cathedral, which is a huge empty space, but yet the staff of the National Cathedral seemed to really work with, okay, what do we have that's valuable here? And with close-ups on the speakers, different camera angles, during the service, various images from around the building, stained glass windows up. Also, I was so impressed with the music. They couldn't have a choir, but what they seemed to do is go for those hymns and that music that is best suited for a soloist, and had a very talented soloist to lead through the service. So, and I know I was talking with a med student who told me, he said, I just don't get anything out of logging into an empty church pastor's campus ministry service. We normally only have 12 or 13 people in service anyway, and I'm finding that it just feels like the scale is right, and it feels on a scale more congruent to the nature of video. So we're finding our way, and it is a challenge. I did a service at the request of a congregation for a group of people, mostly young families, and I'm doing the service sitting in my study here at the house, and but I could see on the screen these young families all gathered around the screen, looking intently into the screen, which is not a view that preachers a lot of times get when we're preaching on Sunday morning in a church. I became very emotional. It was just deeply moving to see all of these isolated families. There was a kind of earnestness about it, about, hey, preacher, if you got something to say in the present moment, come on, say it. Let's hear it. So it's a challenge, and it is great to see preachers and churches trying to step up to the challenge.
Well, so you mentioned this with it's having several people trying to kind of being in community, and that leads me to my next thing I want to talk about, which is Holy Communion. And I mean, probably better than just about anybody else how dear Holy Communion is to me. And I'm conflicted and as to how to deal with Holy Communion, because in a lot of ways Holy Communion is very much about being in that community with each other, being one with each other and one with Christ. And what are your thoughts through all this?
Oh, yeah, I think you're right. I mean, we call it Holy Communion, community, communing, communication, and also for Christians, communion is the supremely body, tactile, physical thing we do in worship. I know as a Methodist, I have found over the years that many of my people value communion because it's the only time in the whole service they get to do anything with their bodies. They get to come forward. Sometimes they get to kneel. They get to be touched and hold out their hands. So all of that kind of mitigates against efforts to do it online and all. I guess I'm sort of more, one is I think probably there's something to be said for simply admitting, gosh, it's the whole nature of communion not to be tactile, to be bodily, to be present, the real presence of Jesus in the bread and wine and the sharing at the table. And so maybe a case could be made for looking for other acts of Christian worship that are more suitable for kind of the online format. what seems to me particularly odd, though, is these words said drive-through communion.
Mm-hmm.
And all, but it just, it just, it seems like, doing a drive-through Thanksgiving meal or something. It's just not, it kind of violates the thing. I also think, maybe there's something to be said. I liked at the National Cathedral, they do, and I forgot the name for it. I had really never seen this. They do they don't call it a non-participatory communion, but they basically go through the whole communion liturgy. And the priest holds up the host and the chalice, and we are urged to commune spiritually. We're urged to remember communion and all. And I kind of liked it because it was pointing to the joy of communion, but also with a bit of sadness and grief that, hey, we can't lie about the fact that we are separate. We are isolated. We're apart from each other. One day we shall be back together, but for today we are separated, and the communion becomes therefore kind of a sign of the sadness of the separation. So maybe I'm kind of for that more than anything. And Jesus says we're to do the Lord's Supper in remembrance of Him. Well, maybe we're in a time when we ought to do the Lord's Supper in remembrance of those meals that the church shared, and look forward in anticipation when we shall again share those again. Even as we, in every communion service, look forward in anticipation to the great banquet we shall one day enjoy in eternity. So.
Right. Well, and I tend to agree with you. I've struggled so much with it, but I think when it comes down to it, one of the things that I've drawn upon specifically, Dr. Lester Ruth, of course, who is such an authority on especially early American Eucharistic understanding, and when he explained to me, and in his writings, how early in Methodism, early American Methodism, communion wasn't celebrated as much, not because there was a lower value, but because the Methodists absolutely had the highest esteem for the sacrament, that it needed to be done well, and they weren't willing to not do it. They were willing to put it off until they could do it with everything and every bit of what they had, meet God.
Good.
In that. So
I like that, and maybe to end a service online by saying, we can't celebrate the Lord's Supper as we have, but one day we shall. And we look forward to that day. And when we do, we want everybody at the table. And there is a sense in which maybe, there's been debate. After worshiping online, going to school online, are we going to say, hey, I just soon, I've had church online for the past couple of months. I'll just stay home in my pajamas with a cup of coffee and worship online for the rest of the year, even after the pandemic goes away. That could happen. I've just seen a good article in the New York Times on after you do college online for months, maybe students are going to say, why should I pay all that money and come live in a dormitory when I can do it online? My counter to that is I just believe the way God has made us. We long for contact. We long for other people. We need bodies in the room. We want to share that bodily presence with one another. And so I'm wondering if we're going to rediscover the joy, the simple wonder of being with fellow Christians around the Lord's table and having a piece of bread handed to us and saying, Christ, the bodily presence of Christ for you. Take, eat. That will maybe this will help us recover that wonder that maybe had become rather mechanical for us.
Well, you kind of hit on there something too in the book is this movement from a convergent to divergent church,
Yeah.
from communal to individual, and because, as you say, people may just say, well, I'm going to sit home and just worship in my pajamas, but also the millennials, the elusive millennials that churches have been trying to attract are open to TED Talks, to that sort of thing. Is this an opportunity for churches to stretch and at least open the door and reach millennials in a way that they hadn't been able to before?
Maybe. I've, for instance, have heard from some people who picked up some of my podcast or virtual sermons that are out there in cyberspace somewhere and pick that up. Maybe so. I do think, and I get into some of this in the book. I get that kind of divergent, convergent thing from Gil Rendell, as you know, right. But I think just built deep into the Christian faith because of Jesus, there is that sense that it's really not church. It's really not faith in Jesus Christ unless it's bodily, unless it's communal. And, when millennials say things like, hey, I don't like organized religion, as I say in the book, what they're saying is, hey, I don't like church because church is the way we do religion. That's the way we organize ourselves. There is no Christianity that is the fullness of Christianity, that where you've got a person sitting alone and meditating. Individual Christians have tried to do that over the years, but that's never been the normative way to be Christian. So I'm just saying that no matter any positive benefits we might get online and from virtual gatherings, I think there is just something at the heart of Christianity that is about congregating, getting together, being convened. And I don't think that'll ever be bypassed. Right. And again, it just may show the power of that. I know in this virtual worship, you can sit there. It's really no opportunity to sing a hymn together, really. Mm-hmm. I know some virtual worship has tried that, and it's pretty awkward.
We've tried that at our home. It's been difficult. It's been we sound in our living room.
And you think about the joy. One of the joys of church, I'm thinking about like with funerals and all. Wedding and Sunday morning. One of the joys is to go and have your voice joined with others. One of the joys is to go when you're not feeling like you want to say anything to God or to sing to God. Well, the person next to you sings for you, and that you join all these different voices in one voice, and suddenly you feel stronger and more faithful. And that's something, it's just hard to imagine virtual that ever being displaced.
Yeah, I agree. I'm hoping though that this is an easy on ramp for millennials to come into church and doing it as congregations.
I was you mentioned millennials, and I don't want to beat up on millennials because I am a boomer, and we get accused of that. But in the early days of the pandemic, one of the scandals was people my age were busy isolating and all, but you had millennials going out to bars, going to the beach, getting together. Well, that's what 20-somethings like do. That's who they are. Well, if you say to them, hey, why are you endangering your health and everybody else going to this bar or this beach? Just sit in your room and Skype your friends. It's the same thing. Well, it ain't the same thing. And so maybe the millennials will see what we have been contending about, that, hey, it's hard to worship God in the name of Christ without being with sisters and brothers congregated in one place, singing with one voice, listening to God's word together.
Yeah. Well, I agree. I think that's a wonderful thing to hope and pray for. I think I'm seeing it I've got my two college age kids home right now, back in their bedrooms, and they're learning to do college online. And my wife, actually, she had virtual happy hour with some of her friends yesterday evening, just sitting and having a glass of wine with a bunch of her friends. And she dearly, dearly missed that. She loved it yesterday, but also dearly missed, seeing her friends and so forth. So maybe so.
Yeah, I bet if the pandemic was declared over tomorrow, I guarantee they wouldn't do that anymore. They would say, hey, let's get together. And they say, no, that's a lot of trouble. Let's just stay and look at each other on the screen. They said, no, that's not the same thing.
Right.
And I need to do a word study of the word virtual. I assume virtual comes from the word for truth, veritas, and so virtual is like it's mostly the same as. Well, I'm afraid maybe we're kind of demonstrating, no, it's a substitute, and it's a workable substitute. But I know. We've been Skyping with our grandchildren, but we had my daughter brought two of our grandsons, and they parked out in the yard, and they hung out the windows of the car, and we talked to them across the yard, keeping plenty of distance. It was so much better than online. And I thought, well, maybe this is just us. We're older people. We're not accustomed to doing everything online. They are more of that generation. But they testified, no, being able to physically see you, it's all the difference. And there's a lot of stuff in the scripture about, the difference between when Jesus stood and appeared among them in John 20, in that wonderful story of them behind locked doors, the first thing they say is, "Oh, it's a ghost, it's a phantom, it's a mirage, it's a virtual Jesus." And he says, "Give me a piece of bread. Stick your hand in my side here." And they said, "Whoa, it's the Lord. It's really Jesus." And I think that becomes a kind of parable. But maybe we are in a time of waiting, and I'm not the most patient person in the world. I don't do waiting that well, but we are in Holy Week right now, and one of the most moving times of Holy Week is that Triduum between Good Friday through Holy Saturday and Easter, and that's kind of where we are waiting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned your grandkids. We our oldest daughter, who lives in Houston, which is about an hour and a half from us, her and her husband made us grandparents in October. So we have really found it difficult to only see pictures and videos and FaceTime, I think is what it is that we do, and so we're really missing that. But before we wrap things up here, Bishop, I just want to ask you, going back to this book again, I think it's a wonderful book for
thank you.
But also for when things get back to normal. And I guess what in my effort to say, gosh, I think this is one of those books, and there aren't a lot of them out there, but this is one of those books that I do think every pastor needs to take a look at. And
well, I'm thrilled.
What would you say to entice them to do so?
Well, I hope it's a book that's encouraging and affirmative to pastors, that the stuff you do, what you're giving your life to in being a pastoral leader is life-giving and absolutely essential. And so I hope the book is maybe not so much giving them new information, although I hope there are some fresh insights that'll help them to work differently and better. But it's a time of affirmation. Mm-hmm. And at a number of places in the book, I talk about how wonderful it is to get to be a pastor who leads. That I had a management coach who was a retired business guy, and he would sometimes say to me, do you know what the president of General Motors would give to be able to visit the sick mother of a troublesome employee? Do you know how much that would improve his leadership and empower him? And he said, preachers do that all the time. I think also at the end of the pandemic, I think this pandemic is going to make theologians out of everybody, because everybody will be walking around saying, how did this happen? And, then we'll hear from Dr. Fauci and all. But when they start saying, why did this happen? That's when the preacher steps up and says, let me go to Scripture and see if I can get any guidance here. And then let me try to articulate that for you. And so there's a sense in which I wonder if one of the byproducts of this pandemic is going to be, for preachers, people are going to be desperate. They're going to be walking around saying, is there any word from the Lord? Or where is God now? Or what might God be up to? Well, gee, that's when a preacher says, hey, let me get in my study, spend a couple of days. I'll be back in touch with you on Sunday at 11, okay?
Well, very good. Well, I do appreciate you taking the time to visit with me today, leading with the sermon, preaching.
Thanks, Wade.
What's that?
No, I think there was a glitch there.
Yeah.
But please, mention the book. Thank you.
And
send me a link.
Okay, I will. I'll send you a link. And again, I appreciate it. And my best to you and to the new crop of D-Men students and all of that. God bless you, my friend.
Thank you, Wade.